Thanks for joining us. We're looking at where we are today as a country, how we got there, some of the signs of the judgment of God. And if you need to go back to the first two videos prior to this one, just to sort of get a reference point of where we are. I want to talk today about how we got to this position as a nation. And again, even though I recognize America is not Israel, America is not the covenant people of God or any of those things like that, there are principles by which God deals with nations, and we see that in the Old Testament. And the Scripture is true, and God has principles and ways in which He acts and things in which He does that are consistent throughout His Word, not just with Israel, but with all the nations and individuals. One of the things that the Proverbs chapter 29 tells us in verse 1, "He that being often reproved hardens his neck shall suddenly be destroyed, and that without remedy. When the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when the wicked bear rule, the people mourn." Well, I think it's pretty obvious. We have a nation right now where the people are moaning and mourning under the bondage and the slavery that we have been led into. We're not rejoicing because righteous people are not in authority. And like the writer says, we have been often reproved, but we have hardened our necks. We've got a stiff neck, and we've bowed up against God, and we've said, no, we're going to do it our way. And as a result, he says, destruction that comes will be sudden and will be without remedy. How in the world did we get into such a state? Most of you that may be watching this, if you're old enough to remember, you can look at the America today that you're living in and then go back to the America you grew up in and say, it's like night and day. Two completely different worlds, two completely even different cultures. How do we get to this place? Well, you can go back, obviously, and we can look at the founding of our country, and we can go through history, and obviously I recognize this nation is not perfect. We have had stains throughout our history. We have had ungodly things that have been done throughout our history. We've had repression of people that has taken place, all kinds of ungodly things done against different people groups and races. I recognize that. But I'll also recognize that through our history there has been a stream of morality and ethic. Some call it the Judeo-Christian ethic that has sort of been a standard, a baseline by which we've operated from. And obviously within our culture, Christianity has had a definite, tremendous impact throughout our history. Not saying our government's been a Christian government or anything like that, but it has had an impact in affecting the morality and our social conscience. But something began to change. Something began to change in the late 1950s and the early 60s in this land. There began to be a spirit of rebellion that began to be permeating throughout our young people, throughout the youth culture. And in that process, things began to happen within our social system and our judicial system. First of all, you had the step where, okay, we're going to take prayer and Bible reading out of the schools. Now, I grew up in a school in Charleston, South Carolina, where for most of my elementary years, we read the Bible. We said the Lord's Prayer every day. This book was revered and honored by our teachers. But there was a place where we said, okay, socially, we're going to start taking God out. When this began to happen, again, you began to see through the 60s this rebellious spirit that began, a drug culture, a rebellious spirit that began to take over against our culture, against that which was the norm. And then you begin to see, moving through the 70s, then abortion was approved, and you began to see, the murder of children, and now over 55 million babies have been murdered since 1973. And as we began to progress, you began to see our society begin to steadily and steadily decline and fall away from those ethics and morals and principles that we were once governed by. How did we get there? Well, one of the things that has happened to us as a culture is we've been brainwashed. Do you realize that there are 6 corporations that own 98% of all the media, of everything that you listen to, everything that you see, everything that you read are owned by 6 corporations, 98% of it. We have been brainwashed as a culture and as a people. The stages of brainwashing, I read an article recently that talked about that, is that first of all, you start out with classical conditioning. It's sort of like taking the little mouse in the cage and you get him to respond to a bell, and he knows when that bell goes off there's going to be cheese over there, and you use training. We have been conditioned by our media, by what we see, hear, read, listen to begin to think a certain way, to begin to develop certain perceptions about life, about God, about government, about culture. And it has been contrary to what we had always known. And we've been bombarded with that. That classical conditioning leads to what is known as behavior modification. We begin to change the way we behave. We begin to change the way we act because we've changed the way we have been thinking. So we begin to change our actions. The Germans in Nazi Germany were very familiar with this. They began to condition the people to think a certain way. And they began to tell a big lie. And that big lie was told often enough to a point where the people saw the lie, heard the lie, listened to the lie, sang the lie long enough, often enough, they began to believe the lie. And that begins to happen. We have had our behavior then to be modified because of what we have been conditioned and how we've been conditioned to think about things. And then behavior modification leads to what is known as a normalcy bias. Normalcy bias, basically, simply stated, is that because as a person you think a certain way, you've never seen something happen, and somebody's telling you that this great tragedy is getting ready to take place, but because you've never seen it, you've never experienced it, you can't believe that it's even possible for it to take place, so you deny that it's possible because you don't want your normal world upset. It's like a security blanket. It's sort of the stick your head in the sand and I hope it goes away mentality. And so we have a normalcy bias now, that when we're being warned that the bridge is out, you know, even though it looks like the bridge is up, the bridge is out down the road, don't go down that road. We've never seen a bridge out before. We've been down that road 1,000 times. No way that bridge is out. We're going to go down that road. You got people warning you about judgment. You got people warning you about cataclysms that are coming, but because you've never seen it, you've never seen an economic collapse, you've never seen a terrorist attack, you've never seen the judgment of God manifested like you read about in the scripture, it ain't going to happen. And you deny that possibility because you've been conditioned to think that way. You've been conditioned to think that way. And that normalcy bias keeps people from taking prudent action in the midst of danger. They are frozen. They can't act. That is exactly where your enemy wants you to be. And then there is the stage of helplessness, where they did an experiment where they took a dog and they put him on an electric grid. And they would shock that dog. And then that dog, realizing he'd get shocked, he would jump over to the side of the grid that was not charged with a shock. And he would go back and forth. Well, then they put up a barrier between the shock side, the electric side of the grid, and the safe side. Well, the dog couldn't get away from the shock. So he would take the shock, but he realized he couldn't escape. Before long, he would simply lay there and take the shock. Well, then they removed the barrier. Now the dog could escape the shock. But he'd been so conditioned to taking the shock that when the barrier was removed, he still lie there, helpless, taking the shock. That's where we as a country have gotten to. We have been conditioned, programmed. Our normalcy bias tells us none of these things are possible. The judgment that we read about in the scripture, it ain't going to happen. We've been being told that for years and it hasn't happened. Why? Well, there's a reason why, and we're going to talk about that. But we've gotten to a position now where we feel helpless and we can't do anything. We're so dependent upon our government or other people to do something for us that even as Christians, we've brought into this state of helplessness that there's nothing we can even do to change ourselves individually. We've bought into a lie. And that is a lie straight from the pit of hell. We can move out of that, and we can change, and we can make a difference, at least in our lives personally, in the lives of our families, even in our fellowships. And we'll talk about that as we look about how we got to where we are, what transpired, and what God's answer is, and what God's solution is for this problem. God bless you.